So today I'm going to talk about the antediluvian civilization, which is the civilization that was present on this earth prior to the time of the flood. And just taking a look at Genesis 3:15, when it says, I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. He shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. Well, here is the promise of the Redeemer as it occurs right at the time God deals with Satan in the Garden of Eden after man falls into sin. And Genesis 3:15, as I pointed out last time, is really the basis for Satan declaring kind of a declaration of war on God. Satan does not want to lose. He doesn't want to have his head crushed, as it is promised there in Genesis 3:15. And so he's going to do everything in his power to prevent the Redeemer from being born. And that's the whole idea of the old, not only at this time, but even post-flood. He's going to try to prevent that line to the Messiah from continuing. Remember that God's creation was perfect. Man had a perfect relationship and a perfect fellowship with God. And that all changed because of man's disobedience to God. And the basics is that man was just unwilling to be governed by God. And there were huge consequences because of his sin. And we talked about some of those last time. Now, as the population expands, as the population of man, of course, expands across the entire world, Satan uses all of the power that he possibly can, again, to block the line to the Messiah. As it says in Romans 5:12, wherefore as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for all have sinned. And sin just expands across the entire world as man expands across the entire world, as the population of fallen man expands to the world at that time. And we see that happen right away. In Genesis chapter 4, I'm not going to go into that. You can read it on your own, but there's conflict, and I'm sure all of you know the account here, of Cain and Abel. There was soon conflict between the seed of the serpent, which is Cain, and the seed of the woman, who is Abel. And Abel represents the seed of the woman, going back to Genesis 3:15. He trusts, he accepts God's word. He trusts in God by faith for salvation through the promised Redeemer. And Cain, on the other hand, represents the seed of the serpent. He distorts or rejects God's word. He comes up with his own program, as we know. And this is really the start of the false religions of man. And Cain relies on his own personal merits to earn his salvation, and he follows his own will rather than God's will in his life. And he rejects God rejects his sacrifice. And Cain rebels against God's right to rule in his life, and of course, because of that, he kills his brother. And Satan, you can see right away, he immediately tries to block the line to the Messiah. And he has the first man born, Cain, kill his brother, Abel, who's the line to who's the first person in the line to the Messiah, or the first child anyway. And he's attempting to eliminate the godly line to Jesus. Cain and Abel, when you look at this particular account, a lot of times they're depicted as young boys. They're not young boys. Cain is approximately 128 years old at the time when he kills his brother. Abel, we don't know how old he is because he was born after Cain. We're assuming that Adam and Eve had sexual relations almost immediately after they were created, and therefore Cain would have been born shortly after that time. Keep in mind that Adam was 130 years old when Seth was born, and I'm certain that there wasn't any lag between the time Abel was killed and Seth was born, other than the 9 months of gestation. So keep in mind that this depiction is not really correct. This one would be probably more along the line of what actually did occur. But as we know, Cain is judged by God, and this sets up this antediluvian civilization. And if you look at the picture of the culture at that time, this is written in Genesis 4th chapter in the 16th through the 24th verse, and I'll pick verses here and there out of those verses. But just about everything we know about this time period, we only know from the Bible. Archaeologists have, of course, dug up various different remains of things, but almost all of those are thought to be post-flood civilizations, and whatever they dig up, pottery or whatever they've dug up. There are a few that are probably pre-flood artifacts, though, that have been discovered, and all three of these have been found in coal. This bell is kind of a famous one, which was probably found about 100 years ago, and it was found in coal, and coal definitely was formed, as we'll find out in the next Sunday school lessons here, that coal was all deposited during the time of the flood. And all three of these were found in coal. This is actually kind of a brown coal here. And these, the bell here is an interesting one because it was found, and the person who found it didn't realize the significance of it, and actually broke all the coal off the bell, and then polished this thing up, and there was no remains of the coal left on it. And because of that, it's been criticized by, of course, the people, evolutionists, as this thing was buried or whatever. And but it's interesting that this was found embedded actually in coal itself. And these you can see are still, and this one was definitely embedded. This is a metal cup, and this is kind of a metal axe with a wood handle. It was all in coal, and these are probably pre-flood artifacts. But it shows, I think, that there was advanced technology during this particular time period, and shows that the culture after creation was not primitive at all. It was a pretty technologically advanced civilization. A lot of people have wondered what the population of the world was at that particular time. If you look at the Bible and add up the ages of the people coming up to the flood, you come up with 1,656 years until the flood occurred between the time of creation. And people have tried to calculate if you had 2 people and take into account the gestation periods, and you take into account the much longer lifespans at that time. We're talking 900-year lifespans. This accounts, by the way, why there was so much technology. If you live for that number of years, anything that you learn, you're going to retain for longer periods of time and be able to apply that for hundreds of years while you're alive. And when you put all the people together at that time, remember too that there's probably only one language at this time. There's no evidence that there were, in the Bible anyway, that there were multiple languages, and that's probably one of the reasons why everything fell apart so bad. But they had large families. Josephus states that Adam had 33 sons and 23 daughters. It's a huge family, 50 siblings. So there was that also as something to calculate into these numbers. And the people were healthier at this time. I think everyone agrees with that. Many fewer mutations involving DNA, considering that Adam and Eve had perfect DNA that would last for everlasting when they were created originally. So if you take all these things and put the statistical calculations together, what do you come up with? Well, some people come up with over 1 trillion people. 1 trillion. That's 1,000 billions. Well, I wouldn't stretch it that far, simply because there was much violence in this culture also. So there were people being killed regularly in this culture, and that would have caused the numbers not to be that high. But on the other hand, even the conservative estimates put it at 1 billion up to about 7 billion. And these more conservative people are like Henry Morris, who has done a lot of writing on the flood. And so, in other words, there are a lot of people on the earth at this particular time. It may be close to the population of what we have on earth right now. So this, what does the Bible state really regarding this time period? And if you look in the genealogy from Cain to Lamech, which Lamech leads up to the flood, and this is recorded in Genesis, the 4th chapter, 16th through the 24th verses. You can get an idea what you see in this particular culture and this civilization. Verse 17, for instance, says he, and this is a reference to Cain, builded a city. And that means that there were urbanization, which is a sign of civilization. And this occurred in the first generation of after Adam. He named the city after his son Enoch. And you'll note when you go through this section of the Bible that there are many crossover names from the line of Seth and the line of Cain. And don't get confused, these are not the same people, they just use the same names. This is not the same Enoch that was raptured off the earth from Seth. And also Lamech is another name that's used, and that those are two different people here. So there are quite a few crossover names, but don't get confused like that. It's just like the name John. I mean, there are Johns all over the place, or Jim, or what other name. Verse 19 says, and Lamech took unto him 2 wives. This shows that civilization started to go off track fairly early on. It shows open sin and rebellion against God. And he took 2 wives, which is the start of polygamy here, or at least the Bible records this, and maybe it started before Lamech, but anyway, it definitely shows that there was polygamy at this particular time. And it's against the principle of God. This is principle of God is monogamy. It's a husband and a wife. the two shall become one flesh, as it states clearly in the Bible. Verse 20 of chapter 4 says that he, Jabal, was the father of such as dwell in tents and of such as have cattle. So we're talking about agriculture here. We're also talking about the domestication of animals occurs. These animals were not raised for food at this particular time, although we don't know that animals weren't eaten because sin was so rampant. Who knows what was going on at this particular time? Because it at least isn't recorded until after the time of the flood, or God makes it acceptable after the flood, but that doesn't mean animals weren't eaten prior to that time because man was in such a state of sin. So you have that in verse 20, and in verse 21 he says, Jubal, who's his brother, was the father of all such as handle the harp and pipe. So it talks about music here. So there's music. Musical instruments were created prior to the time of the flood. And then in verse 22, it talks about Tubal-Cain was an instructor of every craftsman in bronze and iron. This talks about metallurgy and technology that produced metallic implements. So all of this occurred rapidly, and it means that there was tremendous technology here at this particular time. The government is not described. It appears that there was just anarchy. Everybody just kind of did what they wanted, and the strongest was the person who dominated. And there was no organized government or laws. Everyone was for himself, and it depended on their own strength, essentially. Verse 23 here it says, For I, Lamech, have slain a man who wounded me, and a young man for hurting me. This is part of the first poem that was written and is recorded in the Bible. And it's totally against God, and it shows that he was boasting, and actually there's blasphemy within the poem. So it shows again that the falling away from God and this civilization was just getting worse and worse. If you look at the genealogy of from Adam to Noah through Seth's line, now that was what we just talked about through Cain's line, but this is through Seth's line. You see that there's a list of 10 patriarchs that are listed there. The seventh in the line of patriarchs is Enoch. And as it says in chapter 5, verse 24, that and Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. This is a rapture. Enoch was raptured off this earth. He did not see death. This is also recorded in the New Testament in Hebrews 11th chapter. And there's also a reference in Jude verses 14 and 15, which I have up here. And Enoch also, the seventh from Adam, prophesied. So Enoch was a prophet, and it said that he prophesied of these, saying, Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000 of his saints. Now he's looking into the future here, to execute judgment upon all, and to convict all that are ungodly among them, of all their ungodly deeds which they have ungodly committed, and of all their hard speeches with ungodly sinners have spoken against him. So Enoch, being a prophet, looks forward into time and gets this information from God himself. And the revelation that he has is the second coming of Christ. It's not the first coming, but this is a revelation of the second coming of Christ, where 10,000s of his saints will come with him. So that is really kind of interesting that prophecy was way, way back prior to even to the time of the flood. Now within Seth's line is listed also Methuselah. Methuselah, by the way, is Enoch's son. The reason I include him here is because he lived longer than anyone else, 969 years, which demonstrates, by the way, Methuselah at his death is when the flood occurs. So, and his name actually means when he dies, it shall be sent. And that was given to Enoch by God as his name, Enoch again being a prophet. So Methuselah lives for 969 years. It's interesting because it demonstrates God's long suffering. The longest person that lived was the person who lived up until the time of the flood. So God shows his characteristic of long suffering. It's also interesting, though, if you noticed here, that Methuselah overlapped with both Adam, who of course came out of the Garden of Eden, and Shem, who lived after the time of the flood, one of the sons of Noah. And he overlapped 243 years with Adam, from tracing all the way back to the beginning of creation, and overlapped 98 years with Shem, who lived after the time of the flood. So the thing that demonstrates, though, is that one person, Methuselah, connected Adam, the very first person, to Shem, who lived after the time of the flood. And it shows that it was not necessary to pass information through many generations of people like we would have to today, because we don't live that long. We live 70, 80, 90 years old, and we have to pass it through many generations. But in this particular case, that wasn't all that necessary, because these people lived so long. So, and as I said, the flood occurs at the time of Methuselah's death. Now, I'm going to cover the first 4 verses of Genesis chapter 6. I've got them I've got all the verses on the board here. I can tell you that this is one of the most difficult passages in the Bible. And I think just about everyone agrees with that. And there are people who have written on this, volumes on this, and there are good people in every camp. I can tell you that, and I'll talk about the various different groups here in a second. But Genesis 6 shows how bad the world becomes and how much sin is totally rampant across the entire world. It says there, and it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw, and this is interesting here, I underlined some of these words, saw here, they were fair, and they took them. And it says, and the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. It's interesting that one of the commentators that I read on this took these 3 words, and these 3 words are the same idea as Eve in the Garden of Eden. She saw the fruit on the tree of knowledge of good and evil. She thought that it looked good. In other words, they were fair, or they were good, or they were attractive, and she took it. And isn't that, that was her being guided by her emotions and not being guided by what God told her. And the same idea of sin, and isn't that the idea of sin when you think about it anyway? You see something, you think, oh, that looks pretty good, and you take it, and it could be sinful. So it's interesting that the same thing occurred here. And then going on in these verses, it says, and the Lord said, my spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There's different opinions on the 120 years. Most people feel that the 120 years is from then until the time of the flood. And that's the time Noah's got to build the ark. But other people say, well, that means that his lifespan is going to be cut down to 120 years. And in fact, his lifespan does drop drastically after the flood. We'll talk about the reasons for that in the coming weeks. And then these verses go on to say, there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. Now, as I said, these are very difficult passages to try to figure out exactly what was going on here. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure. I can tell you right now, I've talked to a lot of people about these verses, and I'm not certain what they mean myself. I don't know what group I'm in other words. But the bottom line here is that Satan has tempted man into complete wickedness here. And it involves human degradation to the point where God looks at him and says he's all flesh. There's no spirit left in this guy. I mean, they're all flesh. They're like animals, in other words. And it's to the point where God must judge man and he must judge the entire earth. Now, most commentators present what's the views here of what these verses actually mean, and there's two and kind of three views of what is going on here. One of the views is that the sons of God are actually fallen angels. They're demons. And of course, we know that when Satan fell, he took a third of the angels with him. They're demons. They're demons present on this earth today. The sons of God, the reason that they say this is the sons of God, which is B'nai Elohim. When that is used in the Old Testament, especially in the book of Job, it refers to angels. And so the same wording is used elsewhere in the Old Testament, which means angels. However, the people who criticize this viewpoint say that, well, they're not fallen angels, but they're angels nonetheless. Now, literally, what these verses mean is that it appears that members of the heavenly court, or the angels, selected women on earth. They set up marriage relationships with women. Now, as I got here, angels neither marry nor are given in marriage, and this is what Jesus said to the Sadducees in Matthew chapter 22, verse 30. So, does that make this whole idea false? Well, some will say, is this a possible explanation? Well, some will say that this particular incident which occurred here caused God to make the angels and to say that they cannot marry or are given in marriage. And some equate this also with Jude verse 6. Jude verse 6 says, and the angels who kept, notice those words, who kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day. Well, it definitely says that these are angels that are locked in chains, in darkness. We know that all of the demons are not, because demons are present on the earth today. Their demon possession occurs. And demon possession certainly occurred throughout the Old Testament. So when were these locked up? Well, many people will point to these verses in Genesis as this is the time that it occurred. But there are other problems with this. Demons having sexual relations with women resulting in offspring, and I've stated offspring here rather than children. If you'll notice in your Bible, the children is an added word in these verses of Genesis 6. But they had some type of offspring, in other words. Well, that brings up problems associated with angels and human biology. We've got sperm and eggs coming together, and we've got DNA. How does all that work? Do angels have DNA? I mean, it's all kinds of issues. And those issues are more than what I can take, actually, as a person who's, a veterinarian anyway, and a biologist. I just can't, I can't quite get by this. It also causes problems with theology, because sinful men and women, as we all know, we have an opportunity for salvation through the Redeemer, through Jesus Christ, who came to this earth and died on the cross for everyone's sin. And we have an opportunity for salvation. Fallen angels have no opportunity for salvation. They feel they have no opportunity to get right with God. They're going with Satan to the lake of fire. So the offspring of this union, which would be kind of a half and half thing, which group would they be in? This is a theological problem. So I don't know. I'm not sure about this. I can tell you that I had first time I had lunch with John Whitcomb. John Whitcomb, of course, is a theologian, and he wrote the Genesis flood as well as many books on Genesis. And I had our lunch with him one time. The first time I ever had it, I sat down with him and he was across, and I said, "Okay, what do you think about Genesis 6, verse 4 verses?" He just laughed. And he said, "Well, what do you think?" And I said, "I don't know." But he actually is in this camp. He believes they're angels. He says, "I don't know how all this works, but I think," and he knows Hebrew very, very well, and he looked at every Hebrew word he believes it is in. So, I don't know. Well, as I said, there are good people in all of these different groups. One of the kind of spin-offs of this particular group is another theory that could it be that men were possessed by demons and had relations with women, and then the children of these marriages were affected somehow physically and morally by the demons, creating an unusual race. And this, by the way, is kind of John MacArthur. If you look at John MacArthur's commentary, it kind of presents this idea. Some people believe that these men were actually kings and judges at this particular time, but again, there's no real description of what the government was at this particular time. So demon possession. Keep in mind that demon possession at that time, if you were possessed, you could be possessed for hundreds and hundreds of years. Well, that may have effects after some time to your, not only to your mental state and your spiritual state, but your physical state also. And if hundreds and maybe thousands of possessions like this, maybe it could create issues. So that's the other theory. And then the other group, and this is Warren Wiersbe. He's in this group, which is all three of these people that I mentioned, and there are many others, are good Bible teachers. And this particular idea says that the godly line of Seth, which is the sons of God, which is interesting because it's just exactly the opposite of the other theory. The sons of God are the evil ones in the other two theories, and now all of a sudden the sons of God are the good, is the Seth line in this particular one. So it's kind of interesting. But the godly line of Seth, which were the sons of God, had intermarried with the godless descendants of Cain, which were called the daughters of men in this particular case. And this ungodly line had devastating effects on those who were devoted to God, the Seth line. And this does not involve fallen angels in any way. One of the arguments that Worsby gives against being fallen angels, he said that the earth was judged because of man's sin, not because of the sins of angels. And that's a good argument. So these intermarriages caused the children to love the world, conform to the world, and therefore they were condemned by the world. Now, the important part of it is however you look at this, any of the three ways that I mentioned, the line to the Messiah was severely threatened here, to the point where it apparently was going to disappear. Genesis, the 6th chapter, 3rd verse says, "And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years." This is the reference to flesh here. Man was hopelessly corrupt. In other words, he's essentially all flesh, no spirit. And in other words, he's like an animal. So, as it says in the 5th verse, "And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually." So judgment was coming in the 7th verse, "I will destroy man whom I've created from the face of the earth." So God was sorrowful, he was regretful, and decided to put an end to man and judge the earth. The 8th verse of Genesis 6, there's a glimmer of hope here though, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. The only people that God could preserve here, before the line from Adam to the Messiah was lost forever, was Noah, his 3 sons, and their wives. That was it. So there's only 8 people that ended up on the ark. Now, you might wonder, why is this practical today? How can we apply what happened prior to the time of the flood? Well, Matthew 24, verses 37 to 39 state that, "But as the days of Noah were," this is the days leading up to the flood, "so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be." No one knows when Jesus will return. No one knows that. He could be today. People will be involved in their routines of life as they were in the days of Noah, and they won't be thinking about when Jesus will return. That's what this says. And is that like our society and our civilization today? I'd say yes, it is. We're going that way more and more. Most also believe, most people who comment on these particular verses, that significant wickedness, like in the days of Noah, it just was terrible wickedness, will also be present at the time when Jesus returns. Do we see wickedness today? What do we have in common with the pre-flood civilization? Well, as it says in verse 5 of chapter 6, "And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually." Are we seeing that today? That's the question. Well, one of the comparisons is we live in a world where the media now is constant. Constant. And this isn't something that's gone on for a long time either. We have 24-hour television all the time. News programs all the time. Internet access by computer and phone, and now phone, of course. Your phone is, you're essentially carrying around a computer with you. Social media networks are everywhere, and we've seen how they are being used. It's continual. It's not only continual, but keep in mind, it is worldwide. Something goes on the internet, it's worldwide. It can be accessed anywhere, anywhere. So I'm not claiming that there's not positives to this, because there are positives, and there have been many positives. But just think how much the wickedness of man has taken over here. If you look at the Old Testament, Jeremiah 17th chapter, 9th verse, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. That describes man. So those people who are taking advantage of this, it's the wickedness of man is being displayed continually. And for anyone to access, the examples of wickedness and sin are absolutely limitless. I mean, I could go on and on here all day. If you think, just some examples though, if you think of sex that's on the internet, I mean, pornography is a huge problem on the internet. There's no doubt about it. It's everywhere on the internet. But not only that, but social media networks. People are hooking up with other people on the internet. Adultery is common because of the internet. It is just the way people are reacting. It's a huge problem. It's not just that, though. Taking advantage of other people, for instance, financial things, stealing your identity, accessing your credit cards, accessing your bank accounts. All of those things can be done now on the internet. The wickedness of man, he's greedy, so he's going to try to get as much money as possible. And if there's ways of doing it that are illegal, he'll do it. And can you imagine if this occurs on a worldwide scale? It's going to be chaos. And the violence on the internet's unbelievable now. People have talked about in the past computer games, but now, I mean, these things are just 2 weeks ago, there was a murder filmed on the internet of this news reporter, and it was posted on the social media network immediately by the murderer. Just think of what ISIS has done, cutting off Christians' heads in the Middle East. It's on the internet. It all is. So wickedness is rapidly taking over this world. And the entire world is involved because of this mass communication. And essentially everyone in the world is connected. The languages and cultures are disappearing because of it. And the barrage of wickedness, as I've say there, the barrage of wickedness is constant, and it is continuous with mobile devices. Continuous. You can access it anytime you want. So any good or positive applications of the internet, they're fading fast, I'll tell you. Keep in mind, all of this occurred just in the last few years here. I have 15 to 20 years up here, because if you think back 20 years ago, the internet was just really starting. But a lot of this has occurred just in the last 5 or 10 years. Well, can you imagine in another 5 or 10 years what we're going to be faced with? And I guess the question is, when will God once again step in with his supernatural powers to put an end to this and judge man again?